Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. I would like to present our next speaker, who is Jeff Schenck, who is going to be talking about straightening out AngularJS with Python. A big round of applause, please.
Hello. Thanks all for being here. I'm really excited to be up here in front of you all. I'm going to be walking you through a really basic kind of starter implementation of what you would do to take AngularJS and integrate it with a Python backend. It's going to be, like I said, fairly simplistic. So if you've already done AngularJS on Python, you're probably not going to learn anything. And if you're the kind of person who never wants to write a line of JavaScript in your life, you're also probably in the wrong place. I also want to warn you, just briefly, I'm not a pro at this. My only experience is having done it in production for about a year. So we've learned things the hard way, and this is kind of what I want to share with you today. So 30 seconds on Angular, and what is this thing, in case you don't know much about it yet. So it's a JavaScript MV star framework. It's a little bit like any old MVC framework you know, except a little different also. It's basically for, if you've got a lot of stuff going on in the front end of your application, you don't want to hook it all up with jQuery and spaghetti code dealing with all of that. Angular or really any of the other front-end frameworks, Ember and Backbone, are going to be your best friend there. I like Angular. It's interesting. It actually, according to Google Trends, which, as we all know, is a very reliable source of data, overtook Backbone quite some time ago, a year and a half ago, I believe, which was surprising to me, because I had always heard of Backbone as kind of the granddaddy of them all. So anyway, what is Angular? Its claim to fame, what makes it really special, I think, is it extends the HTML vocabulary. So what that means is, you're writing HTML, but you get all of these extra things that you can play with and declaratively write a bunch of HTML stuff that Angular then turns into this beautiful functioning app through the magic of two-way data binding. So you change the value over here, and it automatically updates your HTML to match. This is all really cool, really fun to see, really good to play with. But we're not going to do that here because this is PyCon. And if you want to go to JavaScript Con or whatever they call their thing, you can do that on your own time. Like I said, it's getting kind of popular. And I do highly recommend it. There's still some rough edges. It's still a fairly young framework, but it's really good at what it does. And then, fair's fair. So if you've never heard of Python before, it's pretty great. It also has a number of MVC-ish or MV star frameworks. And at least one of them is actually pretty good. I'm not here to start any fights, but at work we use Django. And so a lot of the examples I'm going to use are all from Django. But the concept should be fairly easily translated. And if you want to yell at me about Pyramid and Flask at the end, you're welcome to do that. Yeah, so the point is all of these things are kind of MV star frameworks. AngularJS on the front end, and then Django or Pyramid or Flask or whatever you're doing on the back end. So, step by step, what are we going to do? First off, we need to have our Python backend serve up Angular. Now, for starters, that's just a base HTML page. No big deal. It's normal HTML like before JavaScript even existed. And usually you'll serve this on the root URL, depending on how you want to set it up. But if Angular is going to be your kind of end-all, be-all application, you're actually going to want to set it up so that all of the URLs all serve Angular, and then Angular handles all of your routing. So what does that look like? This is a very basic Angular app, about as basic as you could possibly make one. And I'm going to do a little bit of hand waving around the Angular. Again, this is PyCon, not JS, whatever. So there is some cool stuff to be done, to be talked about in the Angular world, and we're not going to touch on that. But happy to talk about it afterward if you want to pull me aside. So what are we doing here? First off, we're loading up Angular, right? So we've got that Angular library there, and then your application code, which again, we're not really going to go into. You've got to tell Angular where your app is with this ng-app command. Instantiate a controller, and then here's the magic that we talked about with the two-way data binding. So you can see this looks more or less just like regular HTML, but it's got some special attributes and some weird curly braces and stuff. So the ng-model attribute is what sets up that two-way data binding, and the double curly braces are where you're putting that into your template. And so, you know, the really cool demo that you can go see on Angular's homepage is you type into the input and automatically updates in that paragraph tag there. And it's magic, and it's wonderful. So then all that's left is nothing really special or unique here. You wire it up in your URL patterns. Again, this is Django, but you know, you're going to want to have it serve essentially all URLs, and then allow that Angular app to manage all of the URL routing, which it does kind of on its own. So what else do we need to serve up? What else do we need to wire up? Template partials. This is what Angular does so that you don't have to send your entire monolithic, crazy app all down to that poor browser all in one go. It has what are called template partials. And this is kind of what it sounds like. It's little pieces of template that you can load into the Angular app as you're going from page to page, and it needs that bit of template. But you need to serve these up. Now, if you can get away with it, it's perfectly fine to just serve those up as static files. That works well. It's super easy. There are going to be cases, or at least I found cases, where you need sort of a two-phase rendering, where you need Django or your backend server to render some things in the template, you know, maybe a special ID or a token or something, and then you want Angular to get that template after it's been rendered on the server side. And to do that is a little bit more work. So here's what we've got. You need to add another URL, just wire it up to serve more static, to render out some templates, nothing special. And then the machinery to actually render the template. So you can construct the template name, for example, do your specialness, make whatever craziness you need to make in your app, and then render the output. And then you've got these template partials that you can load up everywhere in your Angular app. What else do we need to do? So we need to communicate with our server, and this is really the meat of what we're doing, right? All of the data changes, all of the data that we're pulling into the app, we need to communicate with the backend server. And the best way to do this is a RESTful API. And it's a big enough deal that it gets its own section. So step 2, you're going to build an application API. And I actually like to think of this as opposed to a developer API. I made these terms up, but they're useful to me. An application API is one where your application is the primary user, and a developer API is one where you want other developers to build things that interact with your code and with your data. Obviously, you could have one API that serves both of those functions. That's totally possible, totally doable, and in some cases, probably a good idea. But there are enough separate concerns that I like to think about them separately. And what we're talking about for our purposes today is definitely the application API. And so we'll talk about some of the special considerations there. But first off, so we need to build a clean, RESTful JSON API. Depending on your framework of choice, there are lots of tools to help you do this. In Django, the Django REST framework is pretty solid. Cornice and Flask RESTful. There's tools for whatever you're building. And mostly they're pretty good, although I think, honestly, for application APIs, they could use a little bit more functionality. They're a little bit weak in certain areas, and I can talk about that. And hopefully, we can contribute some new features back to them at some point. And then on the JavaScript side, you've got a tool called REST Angular, which also I feel like could use a little work, but is still helpful. And that helps you integrate with a REST API on your backend. And so let's take a look at this. If all you want is a simple, clean API, this is all you have to do. So you start by subclassing model viewSet, which is this thing in Django REST framework, and tell it which model to do. And that's it. Then you have to hook it up into your URL routing, which is also fairly straightforward. You generate the routes for free with the viewSet, tell them which router to get into, and hook it up into your URLs. And this works great in cases where all you want to do is the bare minimum, simplest thing. And the world would be a beautiful place if that was all you ever had to do. But unfortunately, there's other stuff. So inevitably, there are issues we're gonna hit where kind of the standard clean RESTful API doesn't really cut it for our purposes. So let's talk about those. What does a sort of clean API look like? First off, we need to do some authentication. And it's not the easiest thing to do right off the bat. Most of these Python backends are very well accustomed to doing cookie-based authentication. It's what you would get on a login page without Angular, just standard login, hits the server, gives you a cookie, makes you logged in, you're good to go. And that's what I ended up using with Angular. But there are also benefits to switching up and going to a token-based authentication approach. There's what are called JSON web tokens, which have some benefits over the cookie-based approach. They're cross-domain, so if you want an api.yoursite.com, and they integrate better with mobile devices. There are some reasons why you might want to do that. What I'm going to show you here is how to integrate with the cookie-based authentication approach. So, please don't look at this. It's gross, it's terrible, and it makes me pretty sad. And this is just one small excerpt of what we did to get authentication working. So I'll walk you through it. The first thing you do is Django REST Framework allows you to create these kind of custom post endpoints. So you're posting to this login thing, which is hung off the tail of your real RESTful API. And so already we've broken the RESTful thing going on here. And then what we do is we actually authenticate by hand ourselves, the user, log them in. And then we're handling all the responses ourselves. And definitely, Django REST Framework provides some of the machinery here that's really nice. Serializing and that kind of stuff. But it's still kind of gross to have to do this every time. And again, this is just for login, because you also want, presumably, a way for users to sign up in the first place. You also presumably want them to be able to log out. And then don't even get me started about the whole password reset flow. It's messy and gross. But if you want users, you kind of have to go through this stuff. So next, so you want permissions now too. If you're going to have users, you're probably going to want them to only see their stuff as opposed to everyone's stuff. If with the traditional methods, just processing everything on the back end, this is fairly well understood stuff. You're probably used to doing it. When you're accessing everything through the API, and it's not a totally open API, there are a lot of things you have to deal with here. It's not just one person being able to see only their things. It's a much more nuanced kind of ecosystem of stuff than that, right? Because you've got some things that you want everyone to just be able to see, right? Like, the tags that are available on your website, or the stuff that shows up on your About Us page, whatever else you're loading in that everyone should have read access to but not write access. Then there's row-level permissions. There's the stuff that the user should be able to see only if it's theirs. And then even beyond that, they're probably supposed to be able to read their own data, but you probably only want them to be able to write certain things in that data. And so this ecosystem starts to get really, really complicated really fast. I'm going to show you a little bit of what we did, but honestly, I think we need better tooling around this. Like I said, I think this is tied to these REST frameworks being mostly built for the developer version of the API rather than an application version of the API. So I'd love to see a little bit better tooling around these, and if I ever get to it, I'll happily work on that. So let's take a look at what permissions looks like. So you wire this into the Django REST framework, and it kind of handles it. This is what we did. You start off by subclassing their base permissions. And then we have this thing that allows you the keys to the kingdom if you're an admin. We've got this thing that if you set it up, you can have global read and write permission. And then if you do this thing, you can have global read permission only. But again, like I said, this is only half of the story, because you also have to do read versus write permission. You want them to be able to write certain things. And it turns out you pretty much have to do all of that by hand on the view set definitions. So as you're writing a particular API endpoint, you need to handle specifically which people can access which things in what ways. So it ends up being quite a bit of work in that way and hard to keep clean. Yeah, and then you want filtering too, which makes perfect sense. Of course you do. So you want to be able to say, I want to see the users who signed up in the last day, or I want to see all of these widgets that were approved. All of these kind of filtering mechanisms. Those also don't come for free, so you have to kind of write those yourself. How do we do that? Well, so you start by writing a filter set with this other library called Django filters. You subclass the filter set. You create the filter that you want. In this case, we're doing less than or equal to the created date. The name equals created relates to the underlying model. Which field on that model do you want to filter by? The lookup type, less than or equal to, and the input formats you specify. And then you tell it which model you're talking about and which fields you're allowed to filter by. At this point, you hook it up into your view set, and it works. But of course, then you have to do this again if you want greater than or equal to. You have to do it again for every field you want to filter on. And the ISO version of the datetime filter doesn't come for free either. You have to write that yourself. So again, I think there's a real opportunity for better tooling around this kind of stuff. But at the moment, it's a little bit of a mess to do. So let's talk about a few out of left field kind of things that hit me. These are sort of signposts for you as you go about implementing your AngularJS on your backend. The first was this, what I'm calling MMVV***, which is not a swear word. This is what happens when your front end is an MV* thing and your back end is an MV* thing, and you want them to cooperate. So, where do you actually put your code? How do you organize things? What's the right way to do this? So these are some of the kind of rules of thumb that I found to be useful. First off, you write your models on the back end, you set those up, they're nice and clean, and then you mirror them in your front end. And so the front end knows what's going on in the back end, accesses it through this API, and ideally, you've got some magic glue between them that syncs everything up, depending on your use case. The controller, this is kind of standard MVC labeling. So controller and view code, in my experience, tends to just kind of be all in the front end. So all of the, in Angular, all of the controllers, all of the templates, they handle most of the work, and very little of this stuff actually ends up in the back end. Now, the last thing that kind of stays in the back end, or at least in our experience did, was a lot of this background processing stuff. So sending emails and doing a lot of background processing, doing kind of some big computational stuff so that there's data that's just ready to ask for the front end. These are things that we still do on the back end, and there's quite a bit of work going on there. I get a lot of people who say, oh, you've got Angular, so you basically just have an API now, right? And in some ways that's true, and in some ways there's still a whole lot going on in the back end, and I wouldn't want it any other way because I love writing Python. So yeah, there's still plenty of work being done in Python. It's just different work. Other fun stuff. Interpolation. This was good. The template interpolation symbols, those double curly braces. It seems everyone kind of wants to use those. Angular, Django, and Jinja all by default use these double curly braces. And so if you want to do this double rendering where Django, for example, is rendering the template, sending it down to Angular, and then Angular runs the template, you can see the problem. But the good news is there's a simple fix. In Angular, you write a config, this interpolate provider. You can choose your own start and end symbols. I think the double square braces are nice. Those also came with their own problems, but that's another story. And a couple of other little things. CSRF wiring can often get broken if you don't make sure to kind of set it up correctly. So you want to make sure that CSRF token gets set on the client side. If you're only ever loading one full web page on that first page load, if there's no forms there, often that token won't get set, and then you don't have access to it. So you need to make sure that it gets sent down with that first page load. And then as you are doing posts through the API, you need to wire it up so that it's in the headers. That was a lot of fun. And then the last fun one that I ran into was API pagination. When you're working on the back end and you've got a bunch of data that you're going through, that tends to just work fine. But when you have an API, you want pagination because you don't want to return all 3 million records. But the flip side of pagination is it's paginated, and you need to deal with that. So if you have a page that's expecting more than 10 or more than 100 of this thing to come in, suddenly you have to write all of this code around pagination. And it's not, at least for me, when it first cropped up, it was a non-obvious sort of bug, which was fun to deal with. I have no idea why those things just weren't showing up in on the page. So, step 4, enjoy your Angular project. This, like I said, I think there's a lot of room for improvement of the tooling. It's still kind of the Wild West out there, although not nearly as much as it was a couple of years ago. And so I encourage you all to try this out. I encourage you all to contribute back your tooling improvements. And yeah, that's about it. I'm Jeff, as I said. I should give a quick shout out to Choose, because they paid for me to be here. And if you get free lunches at work, we can do them better. So talk to us. But thanks so much for letting me talk at you, and now you can yell at me. Thanks. Yeah, so if there are any questions, there are mics there and there.
Hi. Just wanted to point out that Pyramid has the permission stuff built in for anyone else looking at this. So if you want to build on top of Pyramid, that they have that problem solved at least. A bunch of the other ones they don't, but that one at least.
Awesome. Thank you, Pyramid guys. Yeah, we kind of made this transition. We started with a Django app that had nothing to do with Angular, and it was sort of a slow transition over to Angular, which is an interesting story all of itself. But we did not have the luxury of kind of examining all of the options that were out there. But that's good to know.
Hi. So I recently developed a personal Python web app. And I didn't use Angular, but I used Knockout, which is kind of similar. And so some of the gotchas that you described, they really rang true with my experience. One of the things that you mentioned, the concept of having back-end models that are mirrored with a front-end JavaScript implementation, that was probably one of the biggest struggles for me, and I sort of ended up needing that for performance reasons. Did you find any, do you have any experience with that, or any tips or best practices for keeping those in synchronization?
Yeah, God. Not a lot, no. It's a little bit painful. It's a little bit case by case from what I have seen. So, some of the models that I'm dealing with, it's fairly straightforward when you would need to sync that data back up to the server. What I've wanted to do, I believe Backbone actually has some mechanisms for this, or so I've heard. But kind of doing dirty tracking on the fields in your Angular side representation of the model, so that you then know what to send back in a patch request, and ideally when. But honestly, no, I haven't found a lot of good solutions for that. If you come up with any, you should let me know.
Hi, so my experience was a little different. I was writing with Flask instead of Django, and I wound up where it was pretty much just an API and then a front-end app. But was there a reason you chose to redefine the interpolation characters instead of using Jinja's raw tag?
Let me think. So Jinja's raw tag would allow you to just kind of not have Jinja not process this portion of the template. Is that right?
Right.
Not particularly. I didn't want to have to think or worry about it. The raw tag was just a little bit more effort every time you wanted to write it. There's no, I think both are perfectly good solutions.
Is there a reason why you chose to use Django REST framework instead of like TastyPy? Like, did you evaluate several different API packages? And like, if so, could you expand on that?
Yeah. I did do some research up front. I don't have a whole lot of experience directly using the others. I'm sure other people here have better answers than me on this. What I saw with Django REST framework was a pretty robust set of functionality, and I think that proved out. It really is. The other ones, some of them are kind of no longer very well maintained, and some of them seemed to offer a little bit less functionality. So this one just seemed the most robust at the time when we were making that choice. I think the design patterns in Django REST framework are honestly a little bit strange to me, given kind of the way I know and love Python. It's very much kind of the mix-ins idea, which I know there's a lot of opinions there. Mine is that it tends to get really confusing really quickly and ends up not being all that helpful. So I don't love the design patterns, but overall it's a pretty robust, pretty helpful tool.
So you'd use it again? So you'd use it again?
Yes.
Okay.
I am back. Another question. So do you have any insights into effective ways to test these types of integrations when you're working with Python apps and these JavaScript frameworks on the front end?
Can you elaborate a little more? Because there's definitely, testing on the Python side, which is, more or less what you've always done. And then Angular is fairly robust in its testing architecture. So is there an integration point that you're talking about testing, or what's the question exactly?
I guess maybe in terms of functional testing. I mean, Have you guys done any of that, like anything all the way through, like Selenium or like any other approaches that you recommend?
Yeah, we haven't gotten to that stage yet, but I think Selenium's a decent way to go there. You can automate all of that kind of stuff. And I think as long as you kind of unit test all of the things you're doing on the Angular side and you unit test all of the things you're doing on the Python side, that should give you mostly a good idea that everything's working. And then, as always, a few kind of light integration tests is a good idea. Sorry. One more question?
Hi, thank you. Do you have any tips for localization?
I'm sorry, for what?
For localization, French, English, and whatever language.
I apologize, I don't.
Okay.
I'm American. Thank you.